Hi everyone.
Hi everyone.
What we have for you today is the mother of all complexes, how to survive and how to win. So enjoy it while you can, before you get rid of it forever.
Yeah, you can do both. You can survive and you can win.
You definitely can. See you soon. Okay, so today's topic then has to do with the mother of all complexes, how to survive and how to win. And this has been provided by one of our Discord family. He's not a CARDA student, but he is a regular Discorder. And he has a fairly extensive background of fighting against all sorts of issues in his life, very successfully. He's really engaged with the material, if you like, the raw material of his own life in an exemplary way. And this is something that came up and he's given permission for us to talk through. So we might go into the broader background to give context, but fundamentally, this has to do with the influence on his development of his mother and the wider mother complex. So just starting with this now, he writes, I'm calling him A for the purposes of this. Just finished the Complexes What You Need to Know video. A lot of really useful information in there, Steve, especially the stuff about being barefoot. Flexibility is definitely something I need to work on. I think there's an issue with the field effects of my mother and her relationship to me. So he's opening with this, and what he's telling us is that he understands from his studies on our Discord server that what we call barefoot, being barefoot in the practice of life, is important. And essentially what that means is feeling the ground beneath your feet in a physical sense, but also in an instinctive sense, in a connectedness sense to the environment that we find ourselves in, whatever that may be, and how our life has unfolded. And he's aware that flexibility is something that he needs to work on in this regard. But this is a good start. He understands the most important and most crucial thing of all, and that is to be alive in the moment with your feet on the ground and have a relationship to the environment that you have. And that environment is both natural, psychological, and social. But he then, of course, highlights the fact that there are issues with what he calls the field effects of his mother and her relationship to him. And he goes on, inner contemplation has led me to realize how much her Adler has affected me. Almost stunted me, in fact. Stunned, I beg your pardon. In fact, just like the Medusa. Of course, the Medusa is the Gorgon, and in Greek mythology, she would turn people to stone with one look. And then he goes on, I've realized when dealing with the staff members where I live, who are mostly older women, how there's a transference and projection on my part, where my understanding and ability to relate to these women is capped by my mother complex. So we'll stop there before going on. It's obvious that, you know, he's living in some kind of supported living, supported accommodation. There are staff members in there. There are of both sexes, but he's highlighting the older women, or the effect of the older women on him, and that this is constellation, transference, and projection. And that his ability to understand and to relate to these women is capped by his mother complex. So as you guys know, relating broadly is something that is imprinted very early on through our relationship initially to our mothers. And this is an instinctive thing. It's anticipated within the genome and the related fields of the genome. And the way that it manifests in the most important, nuanced, subtle, and overlooked way is that our mothers prepare us for how we will deal with the inner world rather than the outer world. And in particular, our sense of identity and who we are, whether that's biologically male, biologically female, or whatever other iteration of adaptive possibilities that may arise. So something about his relationship to himself, derived from his relationship to his mother, seems to have persisted. In broad terms, then, that will be his relating function as we describe it, or as the Jungians like to talk about it, would be his anima. His capacity to relate to the inner world, his non-ego psyche, so-called unconscious, and how that then is transposed. He says, for example, projection and transference, and we would say that that transposition is a superpositioning factor, so the inner and outer are coherent. In other words, because of the way that his understanding of himself has formed around his relationship to his mother, that then is superpositioned into the environment. It's carried over. And what happens then is that this early form of relating, the relating function and the relating system as the complex, is built around the early relationship to his mother, and then how that is sustained over time. He's now an adult, by the way. He's a fully mature adult. So this is the problem as he sees it. And he's mentioned Adler. And the reason for people who may be viewing this who are unfamiliar with why that should be the case, that he is doing so, is that he's influenced by our work and how we say that Adler, and this is the truth of Adler's work, is all about overcoming feelings of inferiority, overcoming that by action in the world, and specifically through relating at the social level, which goes beyond simply meeting our own needs. So the Adlerian element then is part of the representation of his problem and also the representation of its solution. How does he overcome these feelings of inferiority, which he's received because he hasn't been confirmed or guided properly by his mother in relationship to other people that he meets? So he's aware that he's projecting and transferring, which means technically, in a classical psychodynamic way, that he isn't doing either. He has some consciousness of the fact, the apparent fact, that that's what he's doing. Whereas in strict classical psychodynamic terms, you cannot transfer if you know you are doing it, and you cannot project if you know you are doing it. It is something else at that point. But one of the problems with the classic psychodynamic approach is it doesn't really go into detail about what that something else is. And what we say is that that is fundamentally an adaptive complex that has to do with the individual self-concept and self-image. In other words, who they believe they are, and also the continuity of that belief over time. The continuity of the belief is the self-concept. The inner representation that we chat is the self-image. They're related to one another insofar as the self-image is the focus of the self-concept. And it's there that we get the insight, which otherwise is missing. And that's where the classic psychodynamic schools miss the point of how that complex forms. It forms as an ego identified with complex. And insofar as our friend A here can articulate an understanding of that, he hasn't fully engaged with it. It's still abstract. And that's where the elements of the unconsciousness, if you like, about the identification is still working. Now, of course, our recent videos on complexes explain in quite a bit of depth about what identification is, and with respect to this kind of complex, how that forms along the timeline, takes up position in our self-concept, occupies our self-image. So we won't go into that into any great detail here, but rather suggest that people view those earlier videos. But the absolute important thing to understand is that he has some understanding of what he is doing, but at the moment it's a cognitive abstraction. And how that comes about is that the complex will give some ground over his insight in order to allow him to generate a polarity which loops back and feeds into the complex and supports it. So in other words, I know this, but nothing is changing. I know this, nothing is changing. A polarity. That gap is basically the field of the neurosis. And insofar as he becomes trapped within that, he'll find that his cognition cannot solve the problem. Because cognition, unfortunately, is very amenable to suggestion that works on the basis of polarities, or as to say, dividing things. So he'll end up, and he has done, and I know everyone here is familiar with him and how hard he does work, and end up in a position where he's in a cognitive loop all the time, and it will have a waveform, and it does, whereby he basically constellates an alibi for the complex. Whenever the complex is feeling weak, it needs to reboot itself. And then it appears on the Discord in a narrative that he produces, maybe every 10 to 14 days, something turns up, whereby the complex appropriates ideas and theories to itself, reconfigures them, feeds it back to his ego, and then he releases it onto the Discord in order to draw people to confirm the complex, which is authored this entrapment, this cognitive entrapment and abstraction that he finds himself in. And in broad terms, that's how all complexes work. But for him, with respect to his insight and his understanding of the field of his life, I believe he is correctly placing this in the field of relationship to his mother and how that's worked in his life thus far. So he's got a lot of intelligence, he has a lot of motivation, but his complex is still dividing him. So he's finding it hard to grasp, hard to seek hold of, and understand what's actually happening to him. And again, over time, if this were a clinical situation, you would see this repetitive pattern occurring, probably more frequent than it does with our friend A. And in such cases, then what you find is the complex is presenting in order to force you to confirm it and to be distracted by that. So as a general principle for anybody who is working clinically or working on themselves, if you get the insight of this waveform pattern and how it configures in a repetitive way, that gives you an opportunity to begin to separate from it and realize that the representation of that waveform conceals the complex as such. It's on the surface, and it is meant to distract and to displace the attention of the ego and anybody who may try to help a patient, or if it's happening within us, the whole point of that is to lock us into this cycle of cognitive reductionism and rumination that just cannot solve itself. So that's the defense mechanism. The primary defense mechanism of an ego identified with complex is to do that, is to generate a cognitive loop and then to seek confirmation, firstly inside the ego and then on the outside. Once it's done that, inside and outside are coherent through superpositioning, and then the complex is not only safe, it can operate to scoop more and more associations to it going forward.
Sorry, Steve. Just for clarification on that then, Steve, would it be fair to say that with respect to A's mother complex,
Yeah.
that this is a kind of mixed presentation in a way, because there are clearly identified with elements still operating, but because there's also some conscious understanding of what's going on, that there are probably aligned elements
Yeah.
as well. So it is possible to have more than one type
Yeah.
of complex operating
Yeah.
at the same time within.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned this in previous videos, that it's entirely possible for the field of a complex to distribute itself in simultaneous states, which will include within the field of complexes itself. So you will get some elements that are aligned and non-aligned, where the primary focus, nevertheless, is identified with. And as I said, I think a short while ago, that's part of the complex, is to allow the ego to have access to what appears to be aligned elements, but they are really in focus, nevertheless identified with. That's part of the division. That keeps the person divided, that they cannot make cognitive sense of the distribution of the complex from within the immediate field of the complex when that complex is identified with by the ego. So in other words, we search around inside ourselves, and wherever we are, the complex is there. But there's this hint that somehow it's not only there, it's outside of it. And that's where the image, which may be a mirage, maybe, of an aligned element can distract us, because then we can go off looking for the aligned complex and leave the core identified with elements hidden within the ego. And then if we utilize therapy in that way, we're not really going to touch it, because we're chasing an illusion, or at least only a peripheral aspect of the field of the complex. But that said, you're quite right. In general terms, it's more than probable in most cases that there will be opportunistic aligned complexes that will move into association with it.
Well, that appears to be happening here to some extent, in the sense that the person concerned, tells us that he has some understanding of what's going on, but he also knows at some level that the complex is not fully resolved. So you kind of see that happening within
Yeah,
the field of the complex here.
yeah, you do. So the aligned complex would be entirely independent if it could not be associated to the identified one. That is how you say for sure this is an independent, if you like, aligned complex, and there's no connection with the field of an identified with one. And if that were the case, I would, and this is an empirical preference personally that I have, would be that the identified with elements is the focus. The aligned elements is associated to it. So we deal with the aligned by dealing with the identified. A truly aligned complex will still be there if the identified complex is dealt with, because it's actually separate to it. But once they conjoin, and in effect, then the aligned complex is associated within the field of the identified with one, then you deal with both by dealing with the main one rather than the peripheral one. Otherwise, it's a game of whack-a-mole, because something else will shift in to replace what appeared to be the aligned complex. And it may even have a completely different set of symptoms or originate in a different way. But what will happen is the identified with complex, remember this is part of the ego, will be quite capable of searching into its background experience, its timeline, and saying, that is similar enough. I'll think about that. I'll remember it. And suddenly in doing that, you bring it into association. And then of course the ego identified with complex, which is part of the ego, says, thank you, I will have that. That is now in my field of influence and control. So, Paul's absolutely bang on right with that. But it's what we do about these peripheral elements. But yes,
Well, I think you're suggesting to not be distracted by them, because it would be easy to be distracted by the aligned elements, and not realize that we're not dealing with the core of the complex.
Yeah.
Because as you rightly say, if you get to the core, everything resolves out anyway.
it does.
So
does.
that's really where the focus should be, whether we're working on ourselves or we're working with someone else, with a therapist, say. So that's where the attention has to be principally. Yes, on the core. Yeah.
Yes. It depends on the configuration. And of course, I know our friend A very well, and I know how his psyche responds to the waveform of his life, and also to the support he gets from our Discord family and from Pauline and I. So that insight is really making me focus on the fact that for him, it's this core issue more than anything else. But in support of what you say, Paul, it is entirely possible in other circumstances to leave an identified complex in place, not focus on it, not chase it, but go for the peripheral aligned ones and start to disassemble and break the connection with them. Now, depending on the specific circumstances being considered, that can weaken an identified complex completely. Or what often happens is that we provoke the identified with complex to increase its valency of energy and attention to itself. And that can be a good thing, because once we do that, once we draw it out from the background of the ego, we can begin the process of isolating and dealing with it. But the person may suffer from the increase in drive state, which is actually the complex's feeling, the complex is sensing, the complex is negative intuitions. But because of identification, the ego thinks it's theirs. Like, I am suffering, I am more anxious, I am having more thoughts. But once they can separate off, begin the process of breaking down the identification, it then becomes clear experientially for the ego that it is actually the complex's thoughts, feelings, intuitions, and sensations, and that the ego does not have to feel, think, intuit, or sense any of that, because that is within something that is not the ego. So the beginning of the separation means it doesn't matter how much the identified with complex attempts to resist the process of disidentification, because when it does, it loses its own energy and information and cannot replenish itself through identification. So what will happen there is the identified with complex, when it reaches a certain point within its own homeostasis, will essentially, metaphorically, think to itself, I cannot deplete myself any further. I have to go into conservation mode, and it shuts down. What happens then is it disappears. It's still there, but it's not engaging with the ego. It's running on a depleted information and energetic, by which I mean libido in the classical sense of life force, energy. So that's the first step. We've separated off from it. It has to collapse into itself. What we have to do then is to make absolutely sure that it doesn't come back. And that's when we use altered states of consciousness to ensure that it becomes metabolized by homeostasis and broken down and flattened out, and then it is gone for good. But when we don't do that, and certainly most psychotherapy schools do not do this, what will happen over time is that this conserved state of an identified with complex, we could now say a formally identified with complex, that's shifted more towards being aligned, but it has every intention of re-identifying. What happens then is that it's open to receiving from other sources, energy and information, and these come on the inside and on the outside. And with each accumulation of new information and experience, that complex's energy and essentially its metabolism becomes more effective. And it can then begin to attempt to encroach again because it's reconfigured slightly on the basis of newly acquired information. In that sense, it is like a virus. It's just changed its shell. It's changed how it will configure to bond back to the ego. So just because it's not active and it appears to have gone, doesn't mean that it has. It's gone into a conserved state. This happens, for example, with CBT. So when people work at a cognitive level, and it's a polarized setup again, rational, irrational, positive, negative, and so forth, and little list writing, and then behaviors to confirm one side or the other. That defines the image, the representation of separation from something that's irrational. And insofar as the ego agrees with that and accepts it, you can begin the process of separation. But that does not in and of itself eliminate the complex, because a complex isn't only psychological. It's got a somatic physiological profile. It has that extended out into how we relate to and with other people and situations. So it has a psychosocial dimension. Those elements of the field will still be there, the extended field of the complex. And in those states, it can acquire new information and then change its coat, its representation. Then what happens is that it turns up in the ego's awareness, in its Miller number, as a new experience, which is unsettling. And then the ego thinks about it. And then it's, hang on, this is similar to some, and then before you know it,
Yeah, it's got
the whole thing rushes back in. It's there again. And this is why CBT fails in the mid to long term, because it is suggestion based, but without an altered state of consciousness, which is necessary to bring about the changes in field representational state. In other words, it cannot tackle superpositioning because it collapses into the one meta qualia of cognition. Now, basic psychodynamic-based counseling, not even based on any particular psychodynamic model, outperforms CBT in the middle and long term. Way outperforms it. And it's on parity in the short term. So why is that? Well, because simply working in a dynamic way is sensitive enough to field informational dynamics to have a more sustained impact on what complexes, or as cognitive therapists like to collapse into their understanding of schemas, is. So when we know that we can force something out of identification with our ego into a conserved collapse state, essentially it becomes unconscious. And unconscious with respect to the ego, but the complex itself is conscious in and of itself. When we can do that, then from a classical perspective, that means either suppression or repression. And Freud pointed out, and Jung followed and agreed with him on this, that is temporary, that it will become something else. Freud and Pierre Janet and others, Janet before Freud before Jung, all observed that somaticization results in things that may start out as being cognitive or psychosocial and are then suppressed, which means we don't want to think about it, or repressed, I'm not thinking about it, I'm not associating to it, I don't want to know it's there. It then changes representation and comes back at us in another way. And part of the problem is the homeostative will agree with this and say, we have to solve this. So therefore, I will allow the complex to somaticize and come back at the ego and then say, look, it's still here. We need to deal with this before it distributes itself again and you identify with it again. So it's far better to deal with these things properly, isn't it?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, as you were talking, Steve, about the way that complexes reconstellate, they get some more information, get another angle on things, and they start to approach the ego again. The most important thing, I think, in that moment, and we probably all experienced it, is for the ego not to panic, really.
Yeah.
Because that's when suppression and then repression are likely to occur. So if we catch that moment, if we really can catch that moment and we don't allow that to happen, and there are ways of preventing that from happening, which we've spoken about before, to do with altered states of consciousness and so on, and using them productively, then we absolutely don't have to go down that path. And every time we manage to do that, we catch that moment when the ego starts to, it feels the pressure from the complex to come back online, to reconstellate in whatever configuration. It really must do its best not to panic, and to utilize that moment, because every time it does it, every time it catches the complex trying to do that, it's weakened.
Yeah.
And then eventually, you do get to a point where it's weakened sufficiently for it to metabolize and to be flattened out, and it doesn't come back.
Yeah.
To all intents and purposes, it's dealt with for good.
Yeah.
So I just think that moment, and it is like that. We experience it in that way. There can be a moment, a rush of panic, psychologically, physiologically, psychosocially, however it represents itself, where we have to say, you have to make almost a mental note to yourself. I know what this is. I know what this is. I'm not going to allow it to take my life force, to take my libido. We've said before, you get good at doing this the more that you do it.
It's ego strength.
It is,
Yeah.
it is, because I think, as you've made a point of saying recently, ego strength doesn't mean that you kind of, you sort of grit your teeth and
Yeah.
kind of, you fight it. It's about having the flexibility to do the right thing in the moment, because that's what makes you resilient. That's what makes the ego resilient.
Yeah.
Not just bracing itself and then waiting for something, awful to happen. It doesn't have to be like that.
No.
So even if you, as I say, you experience a moment, or the ego does, a temporary panic when it feels like the complex is trying to come back online, there are ways of dealing with that are far, far better and far more effective than either suppression or repression.
Yeah.
because as you say, that's just a temporary fix. It's going to come back again if you do that.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I'll just finish this part before we move on why we feel anxiety in such circumstances. And it escapes cognitive therapists, for example, and it escapes an awful lot of analysts too. Most of them, I would say, that the anxiety that is felt is Janus-faced. In other words, it's two things, unfortunately, operating at the same time. There's a homeostatic compensation, which is saying, I have to push past the collapse of the ego into cognition. So the anxiety increases, which is the drive state to say you cannot think your way out of this because you've collapsed into too narrow a bandwidth of your ability to think your way out of it. Why aren't you moving into these other meta-quality, the understanding of the affect, the emotion, and the imagery that you're receiving, the intuitions that will help you? Because you don't do that, we increase the amplitude of the drive state. And the second thing is actually why the ego doesn't understand and receive that. It's because the complex is interceding. The ego identified with complex seizes that drive pressure, diverts it away from cognition, so cognition cannot understand what's going on, and turns it into a state that generates anxiety. And the anxiety then is the drive that I need to interpret. I can't understand this cognitively. I must have an emotional reaction to it. I now feel awful. And sensing introverted, it's now in my body. Intuition negative, it's now in the environment. I can't cope. I can't meet demands. And all of that is because it's been misunderstood. The ancestral evolutionary way that the brain and the mind have evolved is not understood by cognition when cognition collapses only into itself. That's so important. And we know from clinical experience that when people do realize that, the cognition is set free. It's completely set free. When it understands this is not me thinking and feeling these negative, this is something else. And it's not me. And at that point, the sense of relief is huge. And then homeostasis can tone down the drive state because the ego is signaling to the wider field that it is receptive to understanding what's actually going on without the complex interceding and redirecting that towards the ego in its own interests, in the interest of the complex. So if you do that with an altered state of consciousness, which increases the power of this understanding, then the ego detaches from the drive state in its negative form, and all of that will duct back from whence it came, which is into the complex. But the ego doesn't feel it. It hasn't suppressed it. It hasn't repressed it. It's received it and redirected it. And then within the economy of the field, off it goes, and the poor old complex gets its own back at it. I'm reminded of that Chinese saying, man who pees against wind gets his own back. So the complex that does that against the ego ends up getting it back on itself. It does work.
Mm.
When we can say, this isn't me. But I have a reality orientation. I'm not disappearing into fantasy. This isn't me. It doesn't belong to me. I know it's there. I know it's real. I'm not trying to pretend it doesn't exist. Just that I choose not to receive it in that way. I receive an understanding of what's behind it. And it's all about self-regulation. That gives you that opening, that window to bring about changes. So these are broad term informational dynamics or infodynamics. And we put this into the context of the mother complex, then it gets very interesting then because that operates at every level of our being, right the way along our timeline. And as I said earlier, it actually forms the basis, the nucleus of what the Jungians call the Anima in a man. But paradoxically, also the Animus in as the Jungians call it, in a woman. It configures slightly on the surface, but deep down it's exactly the same thing. It has to be converted again because it moves off from being the influence of the mother on the self-concept onto the confirmation of the male, the collective male psyche. beyond the boundary of the individual woman. So then men become the problem. And then when she refers on the inside, the mum suggested that men were awful, men were all bad. Perhaps they were all rapists. Perhaps they're all trying to control me or abuse me or whatever. So the mother's animus, using a Jungian zigzag route here, the mother's animus becomes the relating function of the daughter. And that then becomes reciprocally in loop form the mother complex, because that's where it's originated, in the influence of the mother. And then that moves again and it constellates into the field of relating to everyone. But it will settle in particular on men and then on the cultural misrepresentation of men. As you know, Paul, you're doing a wonderful study on this at the moment, aren't you, about how feminism has resulted from these misdirected infodynamics. So I won't ask you to go into depth on that. It's a massive book. It's a massive book, and it's very, very layered and very, very well written. So, the mother of all complexes. Yes, unfortunately it is. Right. I appreciate there was a lot there, quite a lot indeed. So would anybody like to ask anything on that or offer any angle or suggestion? You'd be very welcome. No? Okay. I'll go back to
I've got a question. Oh,
Jess. Here, Jack.
yeah. Can you hear? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Hiya, Jess.
Oh, great. Hello.
Hi, Jack.
I guess I had a misunderstanding. Because I did have this idea that problems with relating to the mother caused Freudian problems rather than Adlerian ones. Like, I guess I associated like the mother with the early years with Freud, and then kind of thought, yeah. And then, I guess I did think that Adlerian problems came more from the father and that time span of life. So just I guess if you can maybe speak on that.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. I don't think you've misunderstood anything at all, but thank you for raising this for clarification. In the context of the case study, our friend A is interpreting it as an Adlerian issue, principally because where he's at in his lifespan development now, that's how it manifests for him in relating to other people. And then he's looking back at his mother and basically saying she had Adlerian problems over control, and I've internalized that. But you are quite right, and this is the value of a discussion beyond simply me reading off an element of a case history, because the Freudian element is there for sure, absolutely. And that is so important. We were going to go on, weren't we, to discuss this, but I'm glad that you've raised it. Because of all the issues of attachment theories, object relations, and all the other stuff that surfaces in the classical psychodynamic traditions. But thank you for that. Did you want to comment on?
I think another way of thinking about it probably is that Freud, Adler, and Jung are present. It just depends on the lens that you use. So this is what Steve was saying, really, Jess. I think about the influence of the mother's animus, say on a son or a daughter, is often more influential than the influence of the father. So, I mean, in a traditional Jungian sense, say, we would maybe be looking at the mother's negative animus.
Yeah.
And then, we'd be looking at the power drive, the Adlerian elements of that behind the Jungian animus. So it's really just a case of how you choose to look at something. So if we get too hung up in a kind of a linear sense, a kind of a linear progression of each model, we might then miss the fact that all those elements are present at the same time. That's probably what we would say, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And again, thank you, Jess, for bringing this up, because it gives us the opportunity to discuss it. So taking what you said, Paul, for example, that the mother's animus in a pure Jungian way becomes the son's anima.
Yeah.
So it shifts. And that's only because of where it settles In the daughter, it takes on a different configuration, but in the son, it becomes what the Jungians understand as being the Anima. But it's also part of the son's perception of the mother as the mother complex. And because it's so formative so early on, that's why we've used the phrase the mother of all complexes, because relating is the key. How we learn to relate to ourselves and others generates every complex we subsequently have. And the other artifact of how I've presented this, of course, is that our friend A has determined how I've introduced it. So it's generated the starting point.
Natasha.
But as you've said, they're all superpositioned anyway. So if we just take this to be fundamentally relating and then developmental, we can see how things appear, and that's how we actually prefer to work, either on ourselves or with other people. Well, we were going to mention attachment styles, which is a very popular thing out there at the moment, and that's also fed into internal family systems and the like. The problem with focusing on attachment styles is that it brings about an awful lot of unnecessary focus and distraction into the past. And it fragments the ego as well. It makes it weaker rather than stronger, because it's emphasizing the negatives rather than the forward projected understanding of how a person can integrate themselves starting in the immediate moment. So when we go back, we tend to go back further than the personal lifespan and back further than the individuals that we have met and been apparently shaped by. We go back into the ancestral psyche where everything is latent and ready and configured to be uploaded. So when we work with people who've in person who've had a lot of issues with parents, and particularly if the parents have passed away, so there's no chance in the immediate moments or in the future of physically or socially changing the relationship they've got to them, then they have to work with the representation that's left. And that representation deep down is always contrasted with the anticipation that the genome had for things being optimal. And that's a fundamental split if well, nobody likes it, but by metaphor, if we like, it's a fundamental split. That if we look at it, we can see beyond the division into that optimized anticipation. And we can say, okay, we can't repair that, but there is more in the ancestral psyche that is interested beyond that for how we unfold and how we develop. We then bring that forward at a deep structure level. So this goes beyond behavioral interactions to help the ego draw on those resources to move beyond it. So it's the same as when we work with trauma. We go back to things that are non-personal, but are stored within us as a resource to move on and beyond. As I say, attachment styles, they're very, within their own framework, very rational. And that's part of the seduction of them. And we can be drawn into that and start self-blame, all of that. Well, that's negative. That doesn't help us adapt at all. The fact of it is real. Yeah, we had these influences. We can or we can't, relatively speaking, do anything about that and out of relationship now, but we can certainly work on the inside. And we can go on the deep inside, right back into the genome and the ancestral psyche and move beyond the situation that we're in. But typically, someone who is suffering, and we've all been there, we collapse into cognition and into polarities, and that never solves anything. Cognition is best informed by other things, then it's liberated from its own entrapment in itself. And I say that's the great relief that people feel, particularly if they've been through CBT and have been processed through that repeatedly, and each time it fails. And then the anticipation of failure is there. And then they blame themselves. And then they're back in the state they were in when they were blaming themselves in the first place, because the mother didn't confirm them, or the mother blamed them, or everybody's like their cruel, negating mother. It doesn't change. It makes it worse at that point. Because suggestion is influence, and suggestion without a controlled by the person altered state of consciousness, which gets them outside of their ego, without those things being built in, it is such an awful collapse. It's almost certain to fail unless the problem concerned is very superficial and homeostasis agrees that a simple cognitive behavioral approach will do. But anything that's fundamental to do with identity and adaptation, we need to go from where these things are originated. We have to go into the deep psyche.
Yeah. You have to make sure you're going there, though, for the reasons that you often say,
Yeah.
Steve, because if you get into mythological representations, which we have here with this case study that we're working
Yeah.
through, but
Yeah.
with A.
Oh yeah.
With A, the
Medusa. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. If we get into that kind of thing, and then we start to amplify off that image of the Medusa, then we're going to go laterally. We're not going to get to the deep
No.
psyche at all.
No.
And we have to be careful of that, very careful of it. If only because no individual woman, stroke mother, is that powerful. And so if we start to get into that, then we're actually making the problem worse, because the magnitude of the problem grows in proportion to its representation. It's like saying you're dealing with a Medusa here,
Yeah.
rather than and you see the complex inflate when it needs to collapse back down to an ordinary level of an appropriate level of resolution, which is actually no, this is we're dealing with if it's somebody's mother, we're dealing with a real human being here who just happens to be a mother. And I think that's so important because of the way in which the Jungians, by and large, take these kinds of
Goes
things.
too far.
It goes way
Yeah.
too far.
Yeah.
And it makes it appear to be a more severe problem than it really is. Because no individual woman is that
Yeah.
powerful. No individual mother is that powerful. They're really not. And I think when you can shrink the complex back down to size and see it for what it is, compassion can come online
Yeah.
at that point as well. Because, it's like, I made my mother into this monster. I've given her all this power over me, and yet actually she's just an ordinary human being like anybody else.
Yeah.
So at that point, I think it's possible to have a real understanding of the real woman and take her power away if you are suffering from her power in an Adlerian sense.
And that's on the outside.
And that's on the outside.
So that's where all the adaptation ultimately occurs.
Yes.
Because when we disengage from the outer world, we're left with inner mythopoetic images.
Yes.
And particularly if we're
Yeah.
unfortunate enough to go through Jungian influence.
Yeah.
Whereas all we really need to say about Medusa or the Gorgon and the idea of turning us to stone, all we need to do is to say that's now a deep structure complex. So the trickster's taking the mickey out of me and saying, look, this is what you're doing to yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And if you can look in at the image that you've internalized of the Medusa, as say as a man or as anyone, and smile and say, well, thank you, but no thank you. That isn't me at all. Then the rest of the myth of Medusa disappears.
Yes.
The lateral distribution that we download with all of that, and particularly if we're influenced by it, and if it was someone, and this is pertinent to the second part of the case studies we're going to look at today, if that's by someone like Marie-Louise von Franz, who has such a high reputation in Jungian circles of being able to laterally distribute or amplify off imagery, then we want more of Marie-Louise von Franz's interpretations of things. And we want more and more of them. But actually, all we're doing is moving sideways.
Yeah.
Which isn't productive. So all we need to solve the problem of Medusa is to say literally, because there is the idea of a reflected image even in the myth of Medusa. Reflecting it back is basically, sorry, but no thanks, that's not me.
Well, it's like the ancient Greek equivalent of the wrathful deities that you talk about in relationship to deep structure complexes.
That's a really good point, because that's how they would deal with
They
that.
would deal with it.
They would be so content and say, you're not real. You're not me. I know you're not me. I know you're a figment of my imagination. And you, Bodhisattva, enlightened mind, is showing me what I'm doing to myself.
Yeah.
But I am not bothered. I am not attached.
Yes.
And behind that then is the peaceful deity, if you like, who is the psychopomp, the guide that moves us progressively more and more towards what they want to achieve in Tantrism, which is enlightenment.
And maybe that's where the fascination with Marie-Louise von Franz really comes in, because of course she wasn't a mother.
No,
That's the first thing to get around,
you
isn't
can't,
it?
you can't
So
transfer that
no,
as a
so
real mother.
no, or you shouldn't do. So what is the real fascination with her? I mean, it would be possible to look at that, I'm sure, and to get something of value out of it.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be that. It wouldn't be the fact that somehow she was this wonderful, caring, omnipotent, wonderful mother, because she wasn't one.
No,
So that's the first mistake to make, isn't it? But
Good.
clearly she was an incredibly intelligent woman, and there's no doubt about that. And the fact that she wasn't a mother maybe meant that she could develop that side of her nature to the extent that she did. So maybe, if you're somebody who's got a mother who hasn't developed herself in that way, who's really very ordinary by everyday standards, you might then become fascinated by somebody like Marie-Louise von Franz, who appears to be motherly, but she isn't a biological mother. But she has something else about her as well that's captivating, and that appears to be her ability, or her, to be a kind of a female version of Jung, for a start, because she's
Yeah.
obviously described in that way. But it's her intellect really that's attractive about her, more than anything else, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you've been very fair to her.
Do-
Yeah, I just she constructed a persona for herself which suggested an androgynous identification with Jung. So it's called Jung in a skirt or a dress. Yeah, but if we don't at least look at that as not attack her,
No.
yeah, and she built a tower like Jung's
She
tower.
did, yeah.
And she was essentially married at a deep level, deep as the Jungians understand to be level to him. She replaced what's her name? Mine's gone blank on that one. Yeah. Well, we all know who she is, of course, but I can't remember her name.
It'll come back.
Yeah, she replaced the other one who wouldn't go deep into alchemy. She refused to do it.
Yeah.
And his wife did. Emma went into alchemy, but Carl still needed Marie-Louise.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there you go. So in that sense, we've got to be really, really careful, because the thing about androgyny as an image, and I don't mean this in context with any trans issues in the contemporary culture at all, is that it's undifferentiated. Even in the alchemical woodcuts, it's an undifferentiation. This blending means that identity is lost by becoming diffused. It becomes distributed and contains all potentials, which is a dormant state. It's not a worked state. So looking on the inside for something that integrates opposites is as bad as looking on the inside for something that separates them. They should separate themselves out for a homeostatic self-regulatory process that then informs the ego and allows the ego to act in the world. But too much introspection means you get pulled into polarities, and then you get dissolved into an homogeneous symbolic morass. And that's a problem. I mean, we've met this with a lot of young men who are very drawn to Marie-Louise von Franz. In fact, the second taste today is by synchronicity, perhaps, around her influence or the memory of her, because she's not here. No, it's a representation. So when we say dissociation first, then representation, dissociation uncouples the complexes from the ego. The ego then has clearer sight. Then it can deal with the representations. Then it can look at Medusa and not be turned to stone. Rather, it can be joyful, as the Chinese Buddhists would understand it. Chinese Buddhists are always happy and laughing about what I'm receiving. That has no effect at all, but I have compassion for you. You're suffering. That's why you've made this image. That's the image of suffering. I have compassion for you, but it isn't me. But I give you my compassion. I help you. There's the ego doing its job towards the inner world appropriately, without being absorbed by it. It's like dream work, Jungian's going about dreams far too much, and that disengages them from outer adaptation. The inner world will regulate itself if the ego does its proper job on the outside. If the ego doesn't do its proper job, then the inner world will intrude. And if the ego starts to push and probe around on the inside, and it's unwelcome, and it often is, then things are sent to us to push us away. Nightmares, horrible fantasies, anxieties. They're only there because we're intruding and we're not prepared. We haven't shaped ourselves to be received properly by homeostasis on the inside, because we're not even adapting externally properly. What the hell are we going to do on the inside? So homeostasis keeps us out and it regulates itself. Hence, if we never analyzed one more dream in our life, our own dream, it would not make that much difference. It would all be sorted. That should give us a huge clue. What are we doing in there? Why are we insisting on interpreting things that are not ego as being ego? And then we get all these fantasies coming back at us, and then some of us sometimes inflate. Whereas we're inflating, but away, paradoxically, from the unconscious and into the ego. We're not even going beyond the ego. It's like, you've gone play in that little sandbox over there that you've made based on fantasies you've picked up in the culture, but do not disturb gene expression. Do not disturb metabolism. Do not disturb lifespan development, which is unfolding no matter what you think.
While you're distracted in the sandbox.
While you're distracted, you're not adapting.
Yeah.
But something will attempt to make sense of all of that, and that'll be whatever it was that caused us to be too interested on the inside, and that will be a complex, and the complex will say, I'll just play with this. I will exist. I will become the new alternative ego, not the alter ego, but an alternative identified with ego, and I will internally project a mirage, which from the perspective of homeostasis is indistinguishable from the ego. So the psyche won't know what's the ego and what's the complex, because the ego's identified with me. I'm in there and I will receive it because I am consciousness within the ego that the ego is unconscious of. That's what an identified complex is. It will receive and take and redistribute, and then we're not adapting internally or externally. But specifically in the case of the mother complex, because of the absolute key role of adaptation to the inner world, that's what we experience first, is an inner representation of becoming as an ego. Our reflexivity experiences that, and it's shaped by the mother. And then for an adult, it's, do I trust the inner world? And if this is a man, no, it's weird in there. It's full of witches and witches. Women are witches, aren't they? They look like them. There's all these stories in the culture about, okay, I don't trust women. Why not? Well, I don't trust this creepy inner world. Why not? I don't trust my mother. And there you see it. There's the associative chain. It's rarely that clear, but when you get into it, then the associations speak for themselves, and you find that root, that labyrinthine thread. It goes back to the time when a person's identity of being human was formed through the intimate psychological relationship to the mother, which nurtured the developing sense of having an identity, having an ego. And then if it's been good with the mother, good enough, we can relate to the world. And then maybe, male or female, we can get on with our father. Maybe, depending on what our father's really like. But we go to our father with a set of expectations, which is genomic as well. And those expectations in both cases form the pressure that we feel. The lifespan development, instinctive, genomic, intuitive pressure to get out into the world and relate. But as I say, the parents, both of them are important, but the primary one for both biological sexes is the mother. She is that which will determine whether we trust our inner world or not. And then we bring the inner world out. And that's what projection and transference is anyway. We're bringing the inner into the outer, and it's tested. And if we don't understand the outer, we refer to the inner. And what shaped that? All of the relational complexes, right back to the primary one, which is mother, followed by father and siblings and friends and so forth. So it's not fair on mothers to be burdened with that, but unfortunately, evolution has done it. A good mother can do everything that she possibly can, but still not be good enough for an individual child who is also being influenced autonomously by internal pressures. But those internal pressures are referred to the mother for understanding and receptivity and a sense of value. It's really tough. It must be, being a mother. It's tough being a father, but I do believe, as far as I can, being male, that it's probably far more difficult to be a mother than it is to be a father, because of that key role that she has as a kind of the first, in fact, inner psychopomp. Now, if the mother is malignant, and sadly there are such people, that will have a very serious effect on the development of a child, male or female, in terms of how they see themselves, and then how they see themselves is measured against their experience in the outer world. I was saying before, I don't think there's any point going through attachment styles, because all we're doing is defining wounds. The configuration of a wound is an attachment style. Why do we want to prod the wound? Surely we should look for health. This shortens the amount of time a person needs doing self-work, individuation, and or therapy, to move into proper alignment with things that have not been damaged by complexes. We go beyond them on the inside, beyond them on the outside. That'll be fundamentally the approach, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jess. That's
Great question.
Jess allowed us to bring that
Thank you.
through. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right, anybody like to ask anything at this stage? You'd be very welcome. No, everybody okay? Right, let's go back to the document now and see how our character A is, our friend A is getting on. Okay, I'm assuming that that's visible. So if we were to reread this again, say it's at the end, or at your leisure once it's viewable, this could all be reinterpreted. What our friend A is saying here could all be reinterpreted through what we said. We get a different angle on it, but one of the things that stands out is the uniqueness, despite that field of information that we've given, the uniqueness of what it means to be an individual and how things then configure according to that. So, Jess, you're absolutely right. Though he mentions Adler, Freud is present. Freud never goes away. Adler conceals Freud, as the Freud-Adler-Jung equation goes. So, insofar as he's focusing on Adler, Freud is still there. Freud is converted into Adler. But this idea about the Medusa, your point was, I think, bang on that, Paul. The way to deal with that is a tantric method. In fact, he actually mentions tantrism in the next part of his account here, which is, like, you spoke in a recent video about how once complexes have been reduced in their capacity to act on the ego, the tantric methods are useful. So I'm wondering what the best way to approach this situation is, given that I recognize the complex, but I still feel incapacitated by it. So what I would say with respect to that complex, given the lived scenario that he's in, is that he understands this at a cognitive, intellectual, abstract level as far as anybody, given his circumstances, could. So I'm not reducing his intelligence by saying that. What I'm saying is that the cognition in and of itself is a problem, and modeling it only that way is a problem. But he is asking for a solution, and he's suggesting tantrism. So a bit more background about our friend here is that he has made efforts to study Eastern methods. He has a lot of experience with recreational substances. He has experience of being on medication for psychosis. Now, again, I'm not attacking him by saying that, but I'm pointing out that his field has been that disrupted into fragmented, and I'm not suggesting he's schizophrenic, he is not. fragmented elements that are all functioning independently but supportive of one another, that it's no wonder that he tries many things and none of them are that particularly effective, because the approach that he's using in and of itself is not joined up. He's going up against a joined up field in a desiccated way. Dissociation and desiccation are different. Dissociation, when it's done properly, is ego strengthening and provides perspective on the whole field of the extended mind of a person. But if we just accumulate different ideas and opinions and we dabble and experiment in whatever that is, we're not having an integrated approach to the problem. And that's because the ego in and of itself isn't strong enough yet to form the basis necessary for that process. So the Tantric methods, and I have discussed this with our friend a few times, it's part of the waveform of the presentation, have to be modified, or he would have to go into entering into being an adept to a tantric tradition. That carries all sorts of issues with it, because they warn people and say that, if you're not stable enough, you risk your sanity. They say it, but a lot of Westerners, I'm all right. I'll just take whatever and I'll be fine, for example. Or it's just another fantasy. Well, it's very real, unfortunately, that if a person cannot yoke themselves, this is what yoga means, that they cannot yoke themselves to the process, which means giving their ego up to being disciplined and channeled in the right way to being able to use traditional tantric methods, then they risk their sanity. Now, having said that, tantric methods don't have to be tantrism as collapsed into an Eastern method. There is a great deal of deep structure parity between using altered states of consciousness through, say, hypnosis. No drugs are necessary, no substances. And what you do in the East, likewise, without drugs, without substances, but you go through a culturalization process. But the advantage of the Western method is that you arrive at the same place, less cluttered at the beginning. So you don't acquire other complexes. You don't acquire whole reams of representation laterally distributed that can distract. You're very focused on the immediacy of real experience. That cuts to the core of some practices within Buddhism, particularly Chan or Zen Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, but a kind of a hybrid, if you like, between traditional Tantrism and Zen is something like how or what the Western approach that we suggest would appear to be to a Buddhist. There's elements of Zen, elements of Tantrism in there. But there are some things which are universal, and that is non-attachment, non-duality, understanding that these inner images that we experienced, at least initially, are fictions of our ego, internally projected and reflected back to us. That's all the Jungian shadow is. It's nothing more than that. If somebody believes in that, it will appear. If somebody doesn't believe in it, then a representation will appear that could be interpreted that way, but can be interpreted differently in a much more healthy way. It's the same with the Anima and the Animus as well. Conveniently, they can be collapsed into Jungian terms, but inconveniently, you get a load of other stuff that comes with it. It's not necessary. The images will still be there, but the way we interact with them determines what they appear to do back to us. And that's what I say about we need to drop the Jungian elements and allow the natural psyche to say, this is what we are. This is what you are. This is why you are experiencing this representation. They're the essential questions. Later, when we've experienced something, we can acquire some theory which explains it to us that does not collapse, and specifically does not collapse into a polarity. That's one of the problems of Jung. It collapses into the opposites. That's a neurosis. Non-duality says that there's no difference. Non-attachment means I'm not going to identify. I won't allow that identification. I am happy. I am content. There is no identification. Now you can change. You can become something else. Not only on the inside, but within the ego and within our interactions in the world. And what we let through then is what the Buddhists interpret as bodhisattva, the Taoists as the Tao, is the right adaptation and attitude to life, uncluttered. So in that sense then, to help our friend A, I would probably, or Pauline or I, or both of us would have to work with him in a way which can be described as being tantric, but is not classically that way. There are things that we can learn from it, that we can utilize, and we find the deep structure meaning that can appear on the surface as tantrism or as hypnosis or whatever it might be. But it would take that in-person guidance. And if that becomes possible, that will happen for our friend. But simply to dabble in things is just the lateral distribution that we've been talking about. And particularly with the mother complex and how far back that goes when we check ourselves. The confirmation is in the background. It's in the shade. It's in the back of the cave, the Paleolithic cave. We can't really see it from the perspective of a mature adult, but it is there. We receive it without knowing we're receiving it. And if that process was injured in some deleterious way, then that's how we see ourselves, and we keep repeating that pattern. But we don't have to do that. There are other ways around it. So as he goes on, then, when I say incapacitated, I suppose I mean an ability to build a healthy Adler. So he's looking at social interests specifically. I know he's familiar with that because that came from Alfred Adler's work as the solution to the inferiority-superiority complex, the power complex, which would mean that all of the latent potential that our character, our friend A, has will come through, but he rejects it because he wasn't properly confirmed. Nobody's confirming him. So he becomes almost afraid of the consequences of his potential. So it has to be repressed, maybe suppressed a little, but it's going to go more than that. What he's aware of suppressing as his positive nature will be much more than that. It will be actively repressed at the level of the complex, which now wants to continue to exist and to scoop every possible confirmation towards itself. But a healthy Adler will be an ego which has overcome that and has stripped away private logic, as Adler talks about it, which is basically the way we think about things. It's wrong and doesn't really match reality. In that sense, it's a little bit like CBT, isn't it? But then guiding fictions, which are the beliefs that we've acquired along what we would call our personal myth, which are the product of complexes that guide us, but they are fictive. Then fictional finalism, as Adler talks about, which is this belief that the end goal will be that if only I could do that, everything would be solved. But that's an illusion as well. In Tantrism, that will be the deity Maya, the weaver of illusion. So there's not a reality orientation in terms of the potential that we have when we're under this kind of influence. Instead, we have illusions, as tantric people practitioners would understand that. Guiding fictions, private logic, fictional finalism, misfired personal myths, complexes based on parents, in particular the mother. All of this then gets referred on the inside to our self-concept. Complexes split off in a Piaget way to attempt to deal with that. They then acquire independence. Then they want to replace the ego. And then instinctive pressure, genomic pressure kicks in to try and force the complex out of the way. The complex lets the stress come through as drive and then invites the ego to make nonsense of that by applying an emotional interpretation of it, which is anxiety. It's a drive state. Turn that back to its source, and the complex feels it, and we don't, as we were saying earlier. So in order and he knows this, our friend, and this is part of the complex trying to say, see, it's impossible. You can't solve this because you'd need their help in person. And at the moment, for various reasons, that isn't possible. So why not say to them and get confirmation, yes, you should do tantrism. And then he can't do that either. Or if he does, it'll be a great risk to his reality orientation. He would have to give in completely the adaptation to his own culture, give it over to that of another culture that may be delivered by somebody who doesn't understand what they're doing, because there's likely to be a Westerner, perhaps even a New Ager. There's all sorts of problems with that. And then he'll feel that tension, and the complex will say, see, you split again and that. But I'm in the gap in between that split. You can rely on me because I'm always here. So he does need help. We'll do everything we can to ensure that he receives it. But part of that will be preparation for what happens when he begins the process of separation off from that complex. Because the mother complex, as that's normally understood, occupies every level of our relating in all of us. If we resolve that, we resolve all relating. Yes, but so,
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, so the thing that's standing out to me is that Adler is his model of choice here anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, he's referring to some of the Eastern traditions, the Tantric traditions and so on, but in the context of his mother, he's chosen Adler, which I think is interesting, because if we think about the compensations that occur, if we understand Adler and the power complex, the chances are, if we apply Adler to both and we apply Adler to his mother, I think we're seeing the compensated probably inferiority in his mother,
yeah.
hence the wanting, the superior behavior, the wanting to be drawn into battle, to cross swords, to be argumentative or whatever. And I think we're seeing a superiority complex in aid because we're seeing the dumbing down of potential, and the kind of the being drawn into the field, the negative Adlerian field of his mother. So, I guess we could go into art as a model specifically to resolve that, or we could just say that Arda describes well the power battle really that's going on between him and her externally, but of course also internally as well, for him and no doubt for his mother as well. And it could be, it probably could be wrapped up just through that understanding of what's going on, let alone any other way of, or any other perspective of looking at the same problem, which we were talking about before, because whether we look at it from a Freudian perspective or, through attachment theory, or we go to a higher register and look at it from a Jungian perspective, he's chosen himself to come in with the Adlerian model. So I think that's important.
Very.
That he selected that, and maybe we should run with that a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. So just finish this paragraph off. It's led to the experience of my mother, which of course isn't solely negative. It's not, no, but mainly probably with respect to how his self-concept has developed, and that's where this thing operates. So when somebody presents a normal duality like that and say, well, she wasn't all bad and this isn't all bad, but no, but you're reacting to the internalization of the representation of her being that way towards the negative. So that's where your complex is operating. And we need to look at that. I feel like I'm often drawn into battle with my mum because of her temperament, and then with other people as well, who are also willing to be confrontational. Usually with my mum, it's because of her conviction, as in she's absolutely certain she knows best when often she doesn't. So I'm wondering how you navigate that whilst remaining true to your field and without resorting to arguments. I mean, a Jungian would jump on the conviction immediately.
You'll explain that best, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, it would capture it sufficiently to give a representation that appeared to do that,
Yeah.
and within its own level, it does.
Yeah.
Because of the so-called conviction of opinion of the animus.
Yeah.
Now, if our friend here is aware of that, then it's leached into this. He is aware of it. So that's embedded within it. And some of the carded guys who are here today will know, because our friend A has allowed us to look at and utilize some of his material before for seminars, will know that this is what his complex does. It embeds things which are almost just below visibility on the radar, but it feeds something in which we could react to. So her conviction is, and she's absolutely certain she knows best when often she doesn't. If he were to detach, then it wouldn't matter what his mother said. Not in a cold way, but in a compassionate way. And it would be more to do with what do I believe? What do I know? What do I think? And why do I know or think it? And I don't mean this cognitively. It's very easy to just collapse into a cognitive representation of what I've just said. He has to feel it. He has to have a dialogue, by which I mean an interaction more than a verbal one, with inner representations of an understanding of that whole state. And he needs to be able to download intuition into that image to tell him how to get beyond it. Not tell him cognitively, but to reveal a modification of that image as it changes into the solution. The ego needs to drop cognition to be able to do that, then receive, and then allow cognition to make an understanding of it when cognition is free of neurotic conflict. At that point, then, it wouldn't be about his mother's conviction so much as his belief in conviction itself in relationship to what he's internalized from the representation of it. And he can move away, and it weakens the complex.
Yeah. Well, I would just say again, if we're thinking, Freud Adler Jung equation, that the conviction is probably at a religious intensity, and that's likely to be protecting her from some sense of inferiority that we then see, if we collapse into Adler, we then see expressed in terms of her psychosocial interactions, and in the way that it does, which is that she wants to cross swords or be confrontational, have arguments with people all the time.
Yeah.
But I think if we understand that that is protecting something which, for her, it feels so vulnerable and inferior, then it's you see the compensation. You see just how fragile she probably really is on the inside, and then when you let that sink in, then again, you have to say this woman really is not it's not as powerful as she appears, because she's actually defending some vulnerability in herself, and therefore she presents herself in the way that she does. She appears to be that way because she hasn't dealt with whatever it is that's vulnerable for her on the inside. So I think that then again brings compassion online. It allows us to see someone for who they truly are, rather than, inflate them into some kind of monster that you then have to do battle with in order to protect yourself.
Yeah.
So it's really all about seeing people as real people, including your mother.
Yeah.
And for someone who needs to do that, it's really quite sad. There is an element in which, like I said, brings compassion online.
Yeah.
Because if somebody feels they have to do that, that is not a happy person. Obviously, it's not.
No.
And of course, there are some people who will be that way because they're set that way in terms of their character. The fact that someone's a mother doesn't have any bearing on who they are as a person, or who they are as a character or personality. That's almost an obvious thing to say.
Yeah.
But it's important not to confuse the two.
Yeah.
Because, you can have a mother who is a bad character, and therefore, if we know for sure she is of bad character, then that explains the presentation, it explains her behavior. But there's no suggestion of that here. This is just more of suggestion of somebody who feels so vulnerable on the inside, so inferior that they have to defend themselves in the way that they do in their psychosocial interactions.
And then he adapts accordingly
Yes.
because he's internalized that image of the person who helped form his representation of himself.
Yes.
And that's where the attachment comes in, that attachment stylists focus on, which is the wound.
Yes.
Okay, we know what the wound is. There's no need to keep talking about it or prodding it or finding another way of saying the same thing. It's got to be about how do we deal with this. Thanks, Paul. So he said, I'm wondering how you navigate that whilst remaining true to your field and without resorting to argument. Well, Jungians would jump all over that probably because they would have been distracted by the idea of the Animus conviction.
Yes.
And they would then go on about swords and all sorts of things that they do and make it mythopoetic. But really what he has to do is practical. It's got to be real world. And the compassion that you've mentioned and the understanding that will come from that will not make him vulnerable to further influence from her so long as he builds a proper place to stand for his ego, which involves compassionate non-attachment.
Yes.
Which is that valuable lesson from the East again. Now, in order to do that in the best way possible, he has to learn and be guided through stages of altered states of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that will bring all of this about very, very quickly, and he will experience it directly as a lived thing. Whereas if it's only spoken about in theory, then it's one idea amongst many. Complexes can generate innumerable ideas at a cognitive level. It's very good at doing that. Well, cognition is good at doing that. And once a complex has got our cognition, it will just generate any old slop, and people will follow and believe in that, whether it's in the culture or it's in our own mind. But the actual practical way of dealing with that is non-attachment, having compassion for yourself as well as for the representation. But the non-attachment is absolute key, because then it will change. It will become something else. Homeostasis says, in effect, this personality is now ready to develop. The genome now can release the potential rather than everything being a fight or fantasy.
Yeah, and in a practical sense, just extending what you're saying here, Steve, he's paradoxically in an environment where he can actually put this to the test.
Yeah.
Because it appears from what he said that he's surrounded by women who they may or may not be mothers, but nonetheless they're employing their care instinct because of the context in which they're working. So he could afford to experiment a little bit, try, change the way that he relates, the way he interacts, even with those that he feels are similar to his mother, in the sense that they're likely to be a little bit argumentative, and then to change them, because then he brings his own. He's using his own power, the power that's intrinsic to him. I don't necessarily mean in a destructive way, but in a way that changes the relationship that he then has to these other women who may or may not be mothers, or maybe potential mothers. So he could utilize that really in a very practical way, that environment.
He could, and the change could be very, very quick.
Could be extremely quick.
and sudden, but not shocking.
Yes.
Anybody, either to him or to others. He needs to place the stand. He talked about Barefoot, didn't he, earlier on? So that idea is taken, but what it really means is that capacity to be in the moment.
Yes.
And to engage with the moment, to change representations
Definitely.
at the level of a psychosocial field, and have that congruent with the inner state of the ego.
Yes.
Once he's got that, everything will follow, because the genome will agree, because this is adaptive, and it will release what he needs, and it will move on quickly. But at the moment, he's too attached to the complex and its representation.
Yeah.
So that needs to change. And of course, I'm sure he will work, because he has worked hard. He has come on hugely. He will work in that direction.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one way of doing that, potentially, is to simply be very interested in the women that he's talking to. I mean, everyone likes to feel that whoever they're engaging with is interested in them. It can be very disarming. It can be the difference between, I'm sorry to use a metaphor again, but between crossing swords with someone and actually diffusing a situation and as you rightly say, Steve, changing it into something else that is far more agreeable. That's good relating.
It is. That's how a good mother should deal with a child who's having a tantrum
Yeah.
or falling out with a sibling
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
has become frustrated with an instinctive adaptation to life, just burst into tears. That's how a good mother does that. Not just by caring in that obvious emotional containing sort of way, but in smoothing the reactions that are going on internally with respect to the external world. I mean, that's how Cesar Millan deals with disruptive dogs, for example. And it works. And we are mammals, like dogs. We have similar instincts at that root level. So being a good mother is like being a good pack leader. As Cesar Millan would understand that with dogs. So we'll move on to B, but I'll stop that for now and just ask if anybody would like to ask anything or make a contribution. It'd be very, very welcome. Everybody okay? I appreciate it's high pressure. There's a lot of stuff here. If anything occurs to you, it feels that it wants to speak itself, please share.
Something came up for me, Steve.
There, weren't they?
Here we are.
They're presented in this scenarios.
Hi, Jay. Go ahead.
Hi, Jim.
Hello. Yeah, just when you were speaking, what kept coming up for me was autonomy. If we're thinking about Adlerian frame and what that means experientially for somebody to receive their own autonomy after being sort of under the influence of a complex's autonomy for so long. And that will be like the deciding factor, wouldn't it, in terms of experiential. So that's kind of what was coming up for me when you were speaking, and just how powerful that could be.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that just that it came up.
It's not just it's everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bandwidth of that is huge.
It is.
Yeah, the ability to allow people to be what they are without us being subsumed into their field of collapse. That's the easiest way to get on with parents when we're older. And as Jung said, nobody is ever going to mature until they free themselves from the psychology of the parents. And that's not just literally as it was, it's the impression of it that we've internalized, i.e. the complex. So, individuation for Jung is only possible when we do that. And I think he said that with such integrity because he knew how limiting his attachment to his mother was, and how he interpreted his father as being failed in a spiritual sense, occupying an office, but it was hollow, the office of the Swiss Reformed minister. And then his mother, of course, was, apart from being quite mentally ill at times, was into all sorts of what would be now called New Age beliefs. And that divided his self-concept, polarized between the parents. So he showed the way in a very helpful way of doing things wrongly and then providing the solution that he personally found to the problem of his own life. In that sense, I think his work is extremely valuable, but it shouldn't be copied literally. And he said, don't do it. And of course, we know the Jungians do it. They all do it. They all want to be him. Doesn't work that way. He said it, but they don't listen. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake.
Hi, Ben. Go ahead.
Hi, Steve Pauline.
Hi, Ben.
Awful. What struck me, in your discussion, is the focus on compassion. Pauline was talking about, at, I don't know quite technically how, we would. I think you've described it. We would have to go back and listen to the things you were teaching. To move into a position of compassion towards, in this case, the mother.
Yeah.
which doesn't lose your status. It actually strengthens you to be able to interact in a healthy, compassionate, which I believe could also be ego strengthening. Um, and then to dissociate from complexes, it would accomplish all of that.
Yeah.
It seems, in one sense, it just seems like an odd suggestion to have compassion. But compassion is so strong in that, um, whoever it is, whether mom or friends or whoever, you're not opening yourself up to their suggestions, but you're holding your stance of compassion no matter what. Um, to which, again, if it's a real person that you're interacting with, it leaves them with not much to go on to continue attacking. In the sense of complexes, it leaves them no room to attach and continue to wreak havoc, on a person's soul, so to speak. And so that was powerful. I mean, we just there's a misinterpretation of compassion as weakness or altruistic or Pollyanna-ish. That's not what we're talking about here. This is quite strong, and so I think that's powerful.
Thank you, Ben. You've really encapsulated it.
Yes,
Thank
you've encapsulated it beautifully. I think the other aspect to it too is that it frees the other person up as well to reconfigure. If there's anything in them that's capable of reconfiguring, then by again, sorry to use another metaphor, by deciding to not lock horns with them, you actually paradoxically free them up as well to go and live their life, because they are also attached in an unhealthy way. So as with a lot of things, I think in relationships, whether it's a married couple or a mother and a son or whatever the combination might be, it takes a person who has, usually anyway, who has more conscious understanding of what's going on to make the first move, because the other person is not capable of making the first move usually. So I think by choosing not to engage, as you rightly say, Ben, strengthens you immediately, and it firmly and squarely puts the problem or whatever it is that's antagonistic in the other person back. It locates it back in that other person for them to deal with. And if they have some potential capacity to develop themselves, it is also an opportunity, which is very much a Buddhist idea as well, isn't it? That idea of opportunity to reconfigure themselves. So there's a lot to be said for it. I mean, I guess I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent here, but it's a little bit analogous, I guess, with the concept of forgiveness in Christianity.
Yeah.
But I think it's cleaner in some ways, to be honest. The idea of compassion. I think I think there's sometimes still room with forgiveness to make yourself a little bit vulnerable.
Oh yeah.
So that, I think, that element of it, I think we have to be careful with. But compassion
Yeah, you can be.
is different
I
again.
agree. Sorry, go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, just please.
Yes, please, Ben.
As I think about it with you, it's actually quite genius and quite efficient, in the sense of approaching things with compassion. Okay, so, hypothetically, not only are we dealing with our own projections and our own ego identify with complexes, now we're dealing with the person that's attacking us, their ego identify with complexes and their projections. And so it's a no-win for if we start again. So it's difficult enough to sort through our own. Why would we so is it our complexes battling their complexes? What is happening? So it could devolve into madness if we just keep going, and often it happens. And that's why conflicts continue to escalate to a point of violence at times. And so now we kind of reset everything. At least that's the attempt, to reset the relationship if we move towards them with compassion. Forgiveness comes later. Compassion is prerequisite to forgiveness, in my way of
Yeah,
thinking.
a good
You
word.
know,
Yeah.
and so, but depending on how they respond to compassion, then there is a way to actually have discussions, conversations to resolve conflicts and move forward and heal the relationship. At least that's the way I'm modeling it. And so it could be,
Mm.
I could be the nutty one here. So yeah, it's not
Far from that, because we know that you've managed that within the context of your own family or the, you know, your sort of wider family, to bring what have been very conflicted situations to a point of resolution where it's literally switched those relationships into their opposite. And
Yeah.
we know you've brought that about in your own life very successfully. So you're speaking from experience.
Yes. And technical
And
experience.
absolutely, yes, both sides of the equation. You've been able to do that, Ben. So yeah, it's the way to go. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would say with dark triad people, you can't forgive them because it's pointless. But you can have compassion for some of them some of the time, and if nothing else, that displaces the attack back into them because you don't receive it. You don't receive the attack. So that's another Buddhist idea of holding the mirror up, and they only see themselves when they attack, and you just kindly give them back what they've given to you. You've returned the gift, non-violently, non-aggressively, but as a statement of non-acceptance of an attack. But forgiveness, turning the other cheek, great, but if you turn the other cheek and you get your head cut off, that's not good.
Mm.
Uh, Not functionally adaptive, should we say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also agree from a position of completion, forgiveness is definitely the right thing at that point because that's the process finished. That's done. That's not premature. Premature forgiveness is dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. But again, forgiveness essentially is canceling someone's debt to you,
Mm.
letting them off the hook and say you don't have to pay back because they can't pay you back. The offense is so grave, depending on how long things have been going on. They can't make it up,
Yeah.
No.
and so you decide to cancel that debt and say you don't owe me that anymore. You're off the hook.
Mm.
Yeah. That takes compassion, doesn't it?
Yes. And you don't want to do that with dark triad. And again, you're asking for more trouble if you do that with dark triad. You just played right into their hands
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
and invited more complexes to form that you can identify with and then devolve into your own madness. Who am I and why is this happening to me?
Yeah, that's very well said because that's what happens with them, isn't it? That's what they do. It's how they try and manipulate, and the complexes become infectious. Then don't they distribute out from the source into others, where they morph in order to fit the environment that they've landed in, like you say. So they go from a dark triad to a victim. It's the same complex. It's just reconfigures for the infection through suggestion.
Mhm. Fascinating. This is fascinating.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank
And
you, Ben.
thank you for the contribution.
Mm.
It's great.
You bet.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to raise anything at this point? No, we okay? Right, let's move on to the second part then. Are we okay on this? I'm taking it you can all see it, yeah? Right, thanks, Ben. So this is B, as we're identifying the person. He is a Discorder, a member of our Discord family. What is your view on men with unresolved mother complexes ending up in relationships with older women? I have read Marie-Louise von Franz's analysis of The Golden Ass, where she analysed that the writer was in a relationship with an older woman, partially due to his unresolved mother complex that was also reflected in the novel. I'll just stop on that point. If anyone's unfamiliar with this, it's the only surviving full Latin novel. It's very, very interesting because it's not like a conventional 21st century novel. It's in several different parts with lots of different things going on at the same time. Many of those individual parts are almost myths in their own right, but we could take them as being part of the field of the novel to show solutions to aspects of the entire field of the novel. The myth of Psyche, for example, is in the novel. There's contributions from Socrates. These are sub-elements within the wider story. But basically what it is that somebody messes with magic or witchcraft with the intent of turning themselves into a bird so they could fly. But it goes wrong and they turn themselves into an ass. And then the main frame or main through line of the story is the adventures of the ass. But the ass has a human reflexivity and consciousness. And as that journey unfolds through different scenarios, the ass learns different things. And there is a redemption at the end, and it comes through a relationship to a goddess who is Isis, the Egyptian goddess Isis, bearing in mind that this is a Latin poet. And part of the redemption of that person is that they should take the religion of Isis into Rome, and that he should become a priest of the cult of Isis. He agrees to that, and he's restored, and he becomes, as I say, a priest, and he's inducted into further mysteries, and he gets the elevation that he wanted by being a bird and being able to fly by other means. In that sense, I think it's a work of genius, because it communicates so much, not only for its main through line, but through those little sort of split off subtexts that go into these accompanying stories. Like you would often get cutaways in movies. Hollywood was fond of that in the 1960s and 70s. There would be a subtext story which was running in parallel to the main one. But rather than only one, there are several, which is an advantage, obviously, of writing a novel. You can do that without straining the time that a movie must be collapsed into. So, given that this young man is someone who is looking for solutions to his life, and that he's gone to marry Louise von Franz and read her interpretation of the novel, and I believe he's read the full novel as well, he's then presented this, and he's concerned with this aspect of the mother complex being constellated by a preference in relating to older women. That is a common prejudice, I would say, that you get, which arises out of instinct at one level, but people think, are you looking for another mother? Because that's an older woman. But that's also reinforced by the kind of judgments that you get from people like the Jungians, in all guises, that is the mother archetype or the mother complex, and that you haven't separated from that kind of thing. I would say that the solution is not clear. That is to say, the solution to the understanding of the problem rather than the solution to the problem in and of itself, if it is even a problem, because it may not be at all. But the suggestion of it is manifest in what's been written. So let's have a little think on from this. I'm noticing a pattern in my life as well. So there's an identification at work. My mother is a very aggressive and Adlerian woman. These are my emphases, by the way, through the italics. And that definitely left some marks. My ex-girlfriend was a few years older than me, and I have been meeting and clicking with a few older women than me lately. Doesn't specify what this age range is. It might be very wide. It might be different in different instances, but he's got that sense of the maturity that he's looking for, at least in the kind of woman he's relating to. That's a different way of immediately suggesting he has a mother complex because he wants maturity in a partner. Different example, but we don't know the full facts. We only have what's here. And I can tell that part of the clicking that he's describing is genuine and deep, but I am thinking that part of it may be due to some unresolved mother issues that are constellating these things. Can you offer any advice, please? Should I just watch the new video, which is this one, when it's out? We don't have enough information here about his personal circumstances, I would say. And it would be tempting, certainly for people like us, to add a distribution to that field that isn't there. And in so doing, suggest that some elements of that distribution are there. But we only have what we've got. On that basis, I would go back to what we were saying about Marie-Louise von Franz. First of all, we have to be very, very careful about whom we choose to allow to influence us, either directly because of what they say or believe, or because of an interpretation they put on something else. This includes an interpretation of something else, but it's also got Marie-Louise von Franz embedded within it as well. That she analysed that the writer was in a relationship with an old woman, partially due to his unresolved mother complex that was also reflected in the novel. That's a definite statement. I don't know what information offhand exists about the author that is that specific, that it could be interpreted that way, but he's leading with that as the second paragraph, if you like, after his initial statement. So if a complex had written this, this is probably how it would write it. What is your view? He's looking for confirmation on men with unresolved mother complexes, a definite statement, ending up in relationship with older women. It's looking for confirmation of an opinion that's likely come from a complex. That complex may be the mother complex, or it may be a pseudo-interpretation of his own situation that implies something negative about his relationship to older women. It could be either, it could be a combination, it could be anything. We don't know. But then we get to the source, the likely source of the authority of that opinion that he's developed about himself, and it's Marie-Louise von Franz. But it's a novel that I believe was written sometime in the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era. It might be BC. I'm not sure about that now. I can't recall. That is significant because it's talking about Isis, who was a very popular cult in Rome before Christianity took hold. Isis was worshipped in Pompeii, for example. A lot of evidence has been recovered from the ruins of Pompeii as preserved under volcanic ash, that Isis was very, very popular. And one of the things about Isis is the redemption, which it has in common with Christianity, and the transformation, but through relationship to the feminine. And Isis and Osiris are intimately linked. So if you relate to Isis, you are also relating to Osiris as well, with respect to the syncretism of ancient Egyptian religion, as that became Hellenized and then Romanized. So that's the context for the novel as a wider perspective on the actual author and their life. So I would say, unless there's definite evidence that the writer was in a relationship with an older woman, partially due to his unresolved mother complex, I would be more likely to say this is dropped in from somewhere else. There may be such evidence, but even if there is, it would have to be definitive beyond belief before I could, or beyond reasonable doubt, before I could accept that this was so important that we had to focus on that. However, to put that into the context of of our character, our friend B, it might be true for him, might not. But if it is true, then this is confirmation that has been looking for whatever complex is formed around those ideas. So are we being paced and led into a confirmation? I'd be concerned about that. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you completely. I think we have to be very circumspect about it. As you say, Steve, the fact it's Marie-Louise von Franz and it comes with that kind of almost authoritative Jungian pedigree, that there's a tendency to just accept it at face value, because if we accept that Marie-Louise von Franz's analysis is correct, then we necessarily accept everything that comes thereafter.
Yeah.
So who's to say that there isn't another way of interpreting this? And I just think we have to be careful. I mean, even just on the question of age, If it's a young man relating to a woman, we don't actually even know how old that woman is necessarily when we begin to
No.
relate to her. So, and there's a difference, of course, between wanting a woman to be mature in the sense that she's developed herself, as opposed to simply just what her chronological age is. I mean, they're two completely different
Yeah.
things for a start. So, maybe he's simply given the zeitgeist and given, unfortunately, to some extent, the kind of women that are out there at the moment. It may just be a case that he's looking for a more feminine, a more mature, a more well-rounded kind of woman than is obviously available, obviously, when young men, go about the process of dating. So I just think, like you're saying, Steve, we've got to be so careful.
We need more information.
We need
don't
far
we?
more
Yeah.
information, and why I think we have to be careful about how much we value somebody's opinion on something, because very quickly could become, if his mother is opinionated in the sense that he describes her as being very aggressive and Adlerian, well, that suggests that probably she's opinionated as well. So do opinions matter? Women's opinions on things matter. Are they being tested appropriately to see whether or not they hang together? Because that may be where the conflation is. It may seem that Marie-Louise von Franz is the more positive version of the very aggressive Adlerian mother, but maybe not. It just depends how we relate to the representation of Marie-Louise von Franz.
Yeah.
I think we have to be very, very careful, personally.
So representation is important.
It is.
Dissociation, first step though, separate off from the image, the imago of Marie-Louise von
Yeah.
Franz, separate off. Then we can deal with the representation.
Yeah.
But when you said about the opinion of women, do they matter? Bearing in mind this is a man, I would say yes, it does, because we receive those first opinions about us and about our imagination and about the process of becoming a reflexive, conscious ego in relationship to the world. All of that was mediated through initially the mother, and then extended women before we get to the father's influence, because the father's interpreted by the mother to the child
Yes.
as well. So the opinions matter.
Yeah.
They matter formatively, but we don't need to maintain those opinions later. That's what separates us off from the complex. When we say, okay, that was formed in that way, but
Yeah.
I'm choosing to be different about this. I am not attached to that anymore. Don't know enough about the background at all, but he's been very honest, and he's also been very helpful, because he's given us permission to discuss this as far as we can here. Because going into depth in text is difficult. Do it sometimes, obviously, but I felt that this would be better addressed in this way through this medium, because there's so many different angles that need to be looked at. So, yeah. The attachment, if there is an attachment, we always have to remember that can be from the mother to the child as well. Never mind from the child to the mother. It might be skewed in that direction. And that goes back to character A earlier as well. What about the attachment of the mother to him rather than just his to her? This is the wider field as it ripples out, and the representations stack up. So I think really he needs, if I can be so blunt as to say needs, because that's like a direct suggestion, isn't it? I think he needs to separate off from Marie-Louise von Franz first, then do his own analysis on that novel and on the different levels that are operating there. And then once he's done that, have a proper assessment of his relationship to the kinds of women that he's engaging with, that he's clicking with, as he calls it. Because a mature relationship means that hopefully a lot of earlier life adaptations have been dealt with, and he doesn't have to repeat the limitations with a life partner that his mother had. That would be a compensation for the mother complex rather than agreeing with it, where he just needs to be a baby and mothered. I'm not suggesting that that's the case, but a lot of people would, a lot of therapists would probably assume that he's overly attached to his mother and wants someone else to take on that role, which will partially satisfy an adaptation to life because it's not his mother, but is somehow like her. That kind of suggestion, and I must say it, I must be really clear on that now. A, I'm not making, and B, it is toxic. It doesn't help. But I'm mentioning it because that's what a lot of therapists would say, particularly those who are into attachment style psychoanalysis, for example, or object relations. So, first of all, he's presented with this. He needs to analyze the presentation and try and work out the order of the way that it's written. So, one thing that I did, one of the few things my father did for me that was useful, was always to read things backwards. So he would say to me, start with that final paragraph and read it backwards. And then he didn't understand this using the words, but the ontology would reveal itself more clearly. So if we do that, his last paragraph, and I can tell that part of the clicking is genuine and deep.
Yes.
But, and here's the opposition to that statement, I am thinking that part of it may be due to some unresolved mother issues that are constellating these things. Can you offer any advice, please? Should I just watch the new video when it's out? If we start with that and then we go backwards, I think I'm noticing a pattern in my life as well. My mother is a very aggressive and Adlerian woman, and that definitely left some marks. My ex-girlfriend was a few years older than me, and I have been meeting and clicking with a few older women than me lately. That's quite a clear statement of context when we read it backwards, I would suggest, and when we read it forwards. So that's his experience of his mother and how he is conceptualizing her control over her own life and over him. And that's left some impressions, some marks. Those marks are the field of the complex, obviously. His ex-girlfriend, this was a relationship that's ended, we don't know how, was a few years older than him. And he's been meeting and clicking with a few older women than him lately. So there's an attempt here to solve the problem that he's asking to be solved in the last paragraph. And we get to, I read Marie-Louise von Franz's analysis of The Golden Ass, where she analysed that the writer was in a relationship with an older woman, partially due to an unresolved mother complex, was also reflected in the novel. That's an entrapment.
Yeah.
And reading it backwards reveals that is an entrapment.
It's perfect, isn't it?
Perfect entrapment.
Yeah.
If you read it backwards, you see the entrapment.
You do.
If we read it forwards, it's concealed by the first paragraph. What is your view on men with unresolved mother complexes ending up in relationship with older women? And while we're thinking about that, we get on to the second one, we miss the point. The entrapment is that a narrative, like a book, if that's interpreted incorrectly, is worse than a dream misunderstood or misinterpreted. Far worse than that. Because a dream is fragmentary when we remember it. It comes and it goes, and there's always more of them. But a narrative in the form of a book, which is ancient and it has all of that built into it, if that is suggested as a vessel for an entrapment, because within that is the fact that Marie-Louise von Franz has confirmed that she, Marie-Louise von Franz, the authority, has analysed the writer was in a relationship with an older woman, partially due to his unresolved mother complex, also reflected in the novel. Our lives are narratives. Our personal myths are narratives. Has he internalized Marie-Louise von Franz as a replacement for the interpretative mother complex, the negative part of that? And that so long as he identifies with the novel, he will be trapped by that narrative. And he will probably know how we treat narratives as ways of trapping complexes. He's on our Discord for a reason. I don't know him well at all. In fact, I think this is possibly the first communication I've had with him. He will know that we use narratives, as I say, to trap complexes, to fix them in there and resolve them through a story. So does he know that the book actually does have a resolution? It solves it. It solves the problem. There's a transformation through relationship to a goddess. That's not a real human being. That's more, as you said earlier, Paul, when you looked at this, that's more of a representation of the Platonic form.
Yeah.
Because of its transformative power.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if we let Marie-Louise von
Oh,
Franz
God.
analyze it,
Yes.
that will corrupt the narrative.
It will.
He should read the novel and
Yes.
experience it.
Yeah.
Not allow Marie-Louise von
No.
Franz, in my view, to interpret it.
He doesn't need her opinion, which is all it is, frankly, to understand it, because, as you say, it will impress on him in a deep structure way that doesn't require the opinion of, another woman who he didn't even know and is only left with a particular representation of. And there may even be one of the things that he might not be realizing is that Marie-Louise von Franz, in some ways, we could argue, I'm not saying she was very aggressive, but she was certainly aggressive when it came to presenting her own ideas. What about her power drive? We could be so careful, haven't we?
Yeah, Tony Wolff, I remember that.
Tony Wolff, yeah.
She replaced Tony Wolff.
Yes, she did. Yeah, she did. But the more you look at this, the more unhelpful the idea of Marie-Louise von Franz's opinion is, because it just appears to me to be trapping this young guy.
Yeah.
It's actually creating a split in him that need not be there.
Yeah.
I mean, if he is experiencing a deep and genuine relationship, he believes he is experiencing that with the women that he's coming into contact with, who's to say that is not real? It's not down to her to
No.
make that judgment, but it's as if she is, because of the way she's represented to
Yeah.
him, as if she has that judgment, is holding that judgment over him.
Yeah.
Which is also in keeping with his perspective on his mother to some extent.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and the first sorry, Paul.
I was just going to say, I mean, maybe I'm out of order saying this, but quite frankly, I would bin it. I would bin it as an analysis.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
You've got to have a lived relationship yourself.
Make your own analysis of it. Allow it to
Yeah.
impact you personally in the way that it was intended to, because of the way that it was written.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what someone else's opinion is of it.
Yeah.
You have to experience it for yourself.
Thanks, Paul. So going back through that paragraph, back to the first one, then we can see that whatever the complex is, and potentially its solution is written at that first line, basically.
Yes.
What is your view on men with unresolved mother complexes? That's a challenge. If that were a complex, that would be a challenge. And the challenge would be probably to say that he has an unresolved mother complex. It's looking for confirmation. That's if it's a challenge.
Yes.
The positive side of his nature, which is probably also embedded within there, is looking for us to say you don't have that. But if that's said simply as an isolated statement without a backup to it, the complex will have more influence, will have more power, more leverage on him because of the way that it flows.
Yeah.
Because the next paragraph, and then we're going back the other way, is Marie-Louise von Franz is constellated as the authority, the magna mater, the great mother, to say that that's what it is. So how can you contradict that?
By saying you're not a mother, Marie-Louise von Franz.
Oh yeah,
we would say that. First off the bat, we did do.
We did do, yeah. But that's the way that, to me, that's laid out. If we run down top to bottom first, then we go back up again, and the field of the complex, which is distributed, it's not a linear thing. It's in all of those paragraphs simultaneously, with spikes, peaks, and troughs of the waveform of how it's constructed. If we reverse the apparent linear pathway of that which is written this, then something will stand out. I would say even if he has a mother complex, he can beat it. I see the defeat of the complex woven in, potentially. But at the same time, there's the entrapment of the authority of the borrowed imago of Marie-Louise von Franz in relationship to a story which actually is a transformative one. So if he has read it to the end, then there's no need for Marie-Louise von Franz's interpretation.
No.
Because Isis solves this. The Jungian Anima, the Platonic form of the feminine, solves the original inflation of the character who wanted to fly, transform himself into a bird. But the attempt was misfired and he ended up as an ass, as a servile animal to people. And he had to learn, the ass had to learn through each step, whilst other things were revealed to him by those little side stories that kept occurring. One of which was about psyche and what Venus or Aphrodite, same character, same figure, did to attempt to frustrate and divert psyche. It's all about relating. It's about a misfired beginning, the wrong kind of instinct, then having to work to do the work to pass through that process and then be transformed. That's exactly what he needs. Yet whatever else Marie-Louise von Franz, I've not read her analysis of it, may have said, that second paragraph is what was chosen to be presented. And there's a challenge in there for us either to agree with her, or if we disagree with her, to bring Marie-Louise von Franz's borrowed authority online to represent the complex. So I'm not sure how many people here have seen us do this kind of thing before with textual analyses, but it's important, to be able to do that and to not be distracted by the ordinary grammar of a written piece, and the way that we would engage with that, like we would with a conversation, everyday life. But, even Freud understood in the psychopathology of everyday life, things are given away in conversations. Things are given away in how we construct things in writing too. And some of those things are complexes, and some of those things are conflicts with complexes that originate in homeostasis that's also trying to get through. So I think this guy has got a good mind. I infer that from his capacity to engage with things like this. He's got a relating function, which he's not fully resolved with yet. He's aware of the potential of his mother complex to be intruding. So I think if he approaches this in the right way, he will make great progress. But that would be an analysis of the way that the text has been written as a hypothesis for moving on from it. Okay, so stop the sharing there and throw that open for anybody who may like to comment. Appreciate it's been heavy, guys. Anybody like to comment on that? Ben, great. Hi, Ben.
Hi. I think it's brilliant to what you just did, starting from the bottom paragraph all the way up. When you started doing that, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. I wonder what this will do. And then it just, some of the things you were saying made a lot more sense going from top to bottom back up. And then, and it's, I think it's a brilliant point that Pauline made. Here's an older woman that he's using as an authority to tell him that his relationship with older women is because he has mother complexes, and if he were to be in relationship with Mary Louise, would she say the same thing?
Probably.
Yes.
Yeah, probably.
That phrase.
Jungians love that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then they say, go to a female analyst and you'll work it out. And they don't work it out. They get entrapped. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, Marie-Louise gave her life over to this, didn't she? To Jung, effectively. It was certainly psychological marriage of sorts. And how different might her life have been had she not done that? Obviously, she had her own background, her own complexes that brought her into relationship to Jung in that way. But and obviously there are many ways of living an authentic life. But we're talking about somebody who almost mirrored Jung's life in terms of our isolation, and her dedication to her own intellect and so on. And if we buy into that, like you say, Steve, we buy into the idea that she is an absolute authority. Here's the conviction side of it again.
Yeah.
So there's such a conviction about her analysis of it. It cannot be questioned.
Yeah.
And that we have to be very careful of, because at the end of the day, it is just an opinion. And there are many, many ways of testing opinions and working around the edges of them to find out whether they stand up or not. And when women get possessed in that way by ideas, they've lost it really. They're no longer in control of themselves. They've given themselves over to those opinions. And I guess for men, it's hard to know what to do, particularly as you say, Steve, because of the primacy of the mother and the fact that opinions do appear to have to be important. And yes, they are, but that they also have to be tested in other ways to check the validity of them. Can't just accept them hook, line, and sinker, because that is so potentially damaging.
Yeah.
And as we get older, clearly we're more of a position to do that, even if it only means that we read around a subject, or we come at it from another angle, see if there's a different way of different perspective of looking at something. But if we just accept opinions as they are, particularly I think young man, then that's the slippery slope, isn't it? It's a very dangerous place to be. So always test everything. I would suggest. We say that about ourselves. Test our ideas.
Oh yeah.
Pressure
Definitely,
test them.
definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't just.
Yeah, he sounds like a knockoff version of Carl Jung.
Yes. Yes.
So the authenticity is missing. She hasn't done her own work of individuation from him. So now she's the authority. Oh my goodness, danger, danger, danger everywhere. And when you went, switch topic slightly here. When you went back and you read the first statement, what is your opinion? I think.
Yeah.
What is your? That's when it dawned on me when you pointed out there's a complex asking that question. I wouldn't have picked that up. So that was very, very helpful to me.
Let's say the one thing my dad taught me to do, which is hold on to, is any lesson you get or anything, just read it backwards, and then it makes more sense. And I found it worked, and it works with this particularly, this situation.
I mean, the final.
Again, the complexes sound, they're so new, they're so subtle. That's why it sounds like an honest question, and it is. But if it came from non-identified ego with the complex, and the complex is speaking through that here, and it's so subtle, it's just brilliant. Sorry, Pauline, to interrupt you there.
No, not at all, Ben. I was just following on from what you said about reading a narrative from the bottom to the top, because if we look at the bottom paragraph, we see more of the integration. We see more of the goal, I think, of this particular individual's trajectory, which is to lose everything else which is above it.
Yeah.
It's as if he knows already that the fact that he's having relationships with, or has had relationships with women who are, and he says it himself, a few years older. Well,
What's that?
well, yeah, what's that? We certainly wouldn't make a big issue of it if it's the other way around.
No.
In terms of a man being a little bit older than the woman. In fact, we probably say we see a lot of that. That's common.
Yeah.
So why should it be an issue the other way around? We're not talking like decades, are we? We're talking about a few years.
Yeah.
And even then, we have to be careful about insinuating that must mean that this person has a mother complex, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. Surely compatibility and the ability to relate to someone in a meaningful way is more important than any of that.
Definitely.
And the suggestion is that he's achieving that in the relationships that he's having to women.
Yeah.
So really, it's really a problem.
Yeah.
As such.
No,
I'm saying not as well.
The story is a primary source. If we were historians, would we override the primary source with the secondary? No, you wouldn't. You'd say, what does the story say? And the story says that the young man who was inflated was reduced to servile instinct, had to learn all of his lessons, and was redeemed. That's a complete story.
Yes.
A good myth should complete itself.
Yes.
It doesn't need anything else.
Doesn't.
It's all in there.
Mm. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Way before marriage will be,
yeah.
Louis von
So-
Franz was even born.
Assuming that
Yeah.
that might be the case, then if there is any mother complex intruding, it's trying to stop him by reference to the authority, the borrowed, because Marie-Louise is not personally involved in this in any way, to be fair to her, but borrows the authority of her to suggest something negating about the engagement with the narrative. That keeps him trapped and not able to solve it,
Yes.
because it's being seen through a lens which is discoloured. And if that refers back to his mother complex, then he should do what we were saying earlier about the disidentification process and compassion, but also having compassion for himself and for his own genome, and to be free.
Yeah.
Because it's how to survive and how to win, isn't it, against the mother complex? You survive by living, by adapting to the outside world, and you win by separation from it.
Yeah.
With compassion. Then you definitely mobilize everything that you have and engage with life properly.
You do, because it's enough to know that you're relating to a real person.
Yeah.
If you're capable of making that distinction, then already, really you've won, because you've made that separation. You know that things aren't being filtered through past experience, and like you say, Steve, it's so liberating that, in a way.
Yeah, the original author and their their understanding of the lifespan trajectory of what it is to be young and it's like Icarus and the Wings, a different take on it, but the idea of wanting that to get above and beyond too soon, and how that will inevitably bring a compensation that's based on instinct. So he had to be turned into a servile animal, but still with consciousness enough, a developing ego, to learn from other people's mistakes, whilst he was almost having the dream of Psyche, the dream of Socrates. This was the individuation process coming out, and then he was ready to receive the transformative Platonic form of Isis, who elevated him properly because he had been through something.
Yeah.
He didn't try and steal it by becoming a bird and getting above himself.
Yeah. So it was earned.
It was earned.
And earned wisdom, really.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why does she have to pollute that with a load of shit? Pardon my language.
Well, yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like you say, though, it's kind of the complexes. It has helped to construct the narrative in such a way that it's almost, if we were still very much into Jung, would be for our delectation. It'd be like, oh, there's Marie-Louise von Franz there, and she's, you say, she's the authority. She must be right. But we don't take that position towards her representation, so we're not going to be corrupted by it. We're not going to be distracted by it. So it can present all it likes, really. We'll see through it.
yeah, she was like a Magna Mater who was unmarried and had no children, like you say. That makes her almost goddess-like. And she was the reflection of Jung. She looked like him,
She did, yeah.
built a tower like him.
Yeah.
It's like Freddie Meyer, if you know Freddie Meyer. He looks like Jung. He sits there with the pipe,
He does, yeah.
and he has the affectations of Carl Jung. A lot of them did it. They took that on and they lost themselves in the process.
Yes.
And then it influences people.
It does, because you're relating to, as you said earlier, an androgynous image. So you don't actually know what you're looking at all. You're doing your best to try and work it out, but you're not sure. And then complexes step in and muddy the water even more. So we've got to be very, very careful, haven't we?
That's the undifferentiation.
It's just the undifferent.
And when Jungians look in and see that, they think it's integration, as if somehow they've got an adapted light. But adapted light is one of differentiation, because Jung himself said it was.
Or it's just an unholy mess if you don't sort it out.
It certainly is. Yeah. It's all based on fantasy, otherwise,
Yes.
which is a huge mistake. But Jungians love fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Imagination's a good thing. Fantasy is a trap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So no mother is a Medusa. No, they're just all real women, real people like anybody else. You just got to work out what it is that's going on, and then you know what you're relating to. Don't have to allow the representation to inflate you in a helpful way.
The first first friend, borrowed that image to describe how he felt stunned by that. Like,
Yes.
turn to stone is the implication.
It is.
Stone doesn't move very well. It just sits there, doesn't it? And it gets eroded over time. So, but time also stands still, you could argue, from the perspective of the stone compared to a human life. There's still a lot of the stone left when the human life has passed away. That kind of thing. So that means that his instincts, his genome and everything, to him on the inside, it is insinuated, have been turned to stone and cannot animate. They cannot become alive.
Yeah.
That's nonsense.
It's just nonsense.
But it is, if he does what we're suggesting, I know he will make progress. And we'll help him
You will.
if he's receptive.
Yeah.
He has to be receptive, doesn't he?
He does. And really, that receptivity just involves relating. The minute you relate, you're animated.
Which is what you were saying, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and how he could completely reverse that situation where he is. Overnight, he could become different. With a small adjustment, other people could see him as being different, and they will adjust.
They will adjust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Well, we're bang on the official time, but I'm happy if anyone would like to ask anything or add anything. If they would, that's no problem at all.
I feel slightly compelled.
Sorry?
I feel slightly compelled.
By all means, go ahead. Go ahead, Ryan.
I just want to take it back to something Pauline said, and then again later that Ben said, that if you're interested in people, or if you're interested in receiving things, but then again not having a perspective where you're naive, you're interested in receiving things from people in your environment, then you're sort of relating.
Yeah. Yes, you are.
And I'm not sure how I got there, but I felt that was related to what you were saying. That last bit, the build up also.
It's what you do, isn't it? It's what you do.
Yes.
And you do with your relationship as well. Even that image of that open space behind you as an extension of your personal field out into the world, and all the relating that you do with natural things and with people. I mean, I know you've shared many of the things that you're involved in that are relating. So yeah, that confirms what you say for sure.
I think also too, Ryan, part of my takeaway from what you said too is that there's an element of risk involved in all relating.
Yeah.
There's always the risk that we might be infected by somebody else's complexes, or disturbed by that relationship in some way. But if we go into it with the perspective that we're not naive, we know how complexes operate. We know how we might become infected by someone else's complexes and so on, then that to some degree ameliorates the risk. It stops us turning to stone. It stops us saying, I'm not going to relate at all, because if I do, the fear is that I'm going to be so damaged by that relationship, I'm not going to relate at all. And I'm certainly not going to relate to anybody else either, because the potential for it to generalize out is ever present. So I think you're right to say, so long as we go in with a degree of caution, which could also suggest a lack of naivety, then we're in the best possible position that we can be to relate and to navigate things cleanly for ourselves. So we have to do it. We're compelled to do it. We're compelled to relate.
Yeah.
It's in our genome to relate.
Yeah.
So we have to do it even with the involved risks.
Yes.
Because they're there for us all, aren't they? Where there's always the potential to be hurt.
Yeah, we've got to be active. We cannot be passive.
No.
because even our own homeostasis will turn on us if we are.
Well, that's a really important point, and I can remember you saying this is a very long time ago now, actually, and it was to do with the way in which some young men, because they've been hurt, become passive, in so much as that they make the decision that if they're going to be in a relationship to someone, say to a young woman, then they'll wait for the women to come to them. They won't actively go out and take decisive action about who they relate to, and that's a mistake. A state to become passive is we have to be engaged, even if we run the risk of being hurt sometimes.
Yeah. As you say, Ryan, that's relating, and to relate means there is some reciprocity. It will come.
Yeah.
It's less likely to come if we don't.
Mm.
We have to engage with life.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about that.
And then if you follow your intuition, you do the right things. You follow the right path. You relate to the right people.
Yeah, and that again is a very important point. It's not easy to follow intuition if we're not receptive to it. So it's there, but we don't receive it. It's weird. But when we open ourselves up, suddenly everything drops in. And if we're in a state of not trusting intuition, it doesn't trust us because we're not a good enough receptacle for it. And by that, I mean the bandwidth of what it delivers, which is a much wider perspective than we can detect through our immediate senses or our immediate consciousness. All of that is still there, undetected, and is not informing or updating us. And then homeostasis collapses into its baseline, which is metabolic regulation. In other words, the body turns over and does what it does every day at a metabolic level, but the psyche can't get through and eventually gives up, and then the genome gives up, and then that's it. We just run out on a clock then, and there's no engagement with life. But when we're open to wider field perspectives, it's like with parapsychological phenomenon, and I would say that is intuition as well. It's a wider field sentience. If you're open to that, you get used to it. And it's no longer superstitious, it's factual, and it's ordinary, and you relate to it, and it relates to you, and you accept it. But when we shut ourselves off from it, we don't see it, which is why skeptics don't experience parapsychology, because they're not open to receiving the bandwidth of information that intuition primarily represents, which is always big. The intuition opens out into parapsychological phenomenon, and then it opens out into platonic field level sentience. All that's absent with people who are either neurotic and suffer, or they're cognitively collapsed and up themselves. The outcome is the same in both cases. Ego inflation by collapse or neurosis by splitting. There's a lack of engagement with the opportunities that exist and just all around us in time and in space.
I agree.
Well, you live it, don't you?
I try.
You do.
It seems to
Well, yeah.
occur.
Yes. Yeah, it will increase. And as you get to work with yourselves in your relationship, and then you work with people relationally beyond that, and then perhaps in therapy, it'll become so ordinary, but complementary to your life that things just arrange themselves. And it's like, oh, it's happening again. What's it trying to tell me? So you refer to it's not like, oh, it's definitely real and true in a superstitious, collapsed way. It's an openness to a field of information and representation.
Right. I think part of the confirmation of that is that you're not even looking for it.
Yeah.
It just occurs. I mean, maybe you're seeking to be on the path, but
Yeah.
When things like that occur,
Yeah.
it's out of the ordinary.
Yeah, and they become ordinary.
Right. I sort of meant that both ways.
Yeah, you did, of course. But you're cut off from sharing that with people who are collapsed because they can't get them.
And in a lot of cases, people who are collapsed are really just suffering.
Yes, they're the neurotic sufferers. Yeah, it's just sad. It is sad, and we need compassion for them. I've got almost no compassion for people who collapse into cognition because they've inflated intellectually. None, none. They're just nuisances, get in the way of other people having a real life, their mind themselves.
It's an understandable position to take.
Yeah.
See, especially when you see how it affects the lives of the people that they affect.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, particularly if they're authorities, like Marie-Louise von Franz. I mean, you could
Quote unquote.
you could put her in that category.
You could. I mean, she wrote about all sorts of things, including synchronicity and quantum mechanics. But nobody outside of Jungian circles took a blind bit of notice of her theories on synchronicity and quantum mechanics. None of them. So in that sense, her contribution was within level. It was big, within level, but not in an extended way. So in that sense, I would say that she didn't reach that many people in her own lifetime. She's reached more afterwards through published works and representations. That's inevitable, so long as someone's memory survives their personal life by representation. But Jung didn't see that many people. He saw a few people for a very long time. But he didn't see a lot of people once he left the Berkholz sleep. When he was in there were a lot of people in there, and he worked damned hard. He did a lot of good work, scientific work, valid scientific work about complexes. But afterwards, he didn't see that many people. And the ones he did, he chose probably because they confirmed his model. That's up to him, was up to him. But I wouldn't say that just because someone like Marie-Louise was around for a long time that she was actually that experienced. You need variation to make experience valid. If you don't have variation in the people that you meet as a therapist, then once you've seen one, you've seen 100 because it's only the same thing you're seeing anyway. There isn't enough variation. So I would always say get as much experience as you can with as many different people as possible. Everyone is a kind of reciprocal teacher who will teach us more than we knew before. We're just paddling around inside dreams and abstractions and fantasies repeatedly for years on end with a handful of people. It's not going to produce much of any value at all.
Yes. Yeah.
But that's just an opinion. Based on empiricism, but it's just an opinion.
It's a very much appreciated one.
Thank you.
I think also the more widely, the better, but that's again my opinion.
I agree. Everything that you do and you are doing with your good lady is engaging with the world and influencing the field of the world. That's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, it's nice when you can see that too. It's and not in a way that like you're looking for it. People are confirming it because they can see you're seeking it, but
Yeah.
because you're open to intuition and you see the downstream effects of things that you recall.
Yeah.
And I wanted to thank you for going into that story about the golden.
Oh, the golden ass. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it sort of showed how when you go into it, it opens up
Mm.
and it doesn't collapse.
No, I would say as a structure, it's near perfect, and thank God it survived when none of the others did in complete form. So in that sense, I think it's very valuable.
Yeah, there didn't feel like anything overlaid onto it. As you said, MLVF or pumped it full of for lots of people to be influenced by.
Yeah. And her time's done, and she's got no say on how her memory and her image is used. Which is in mitigation, really, for her. She lived an authentic life, to be fair, by the way she lived it. It had its own contained authenticity, but we have to be really, really careful about allowing these remnant representations to take on a reified form that influences us, because we've lost the direct context of that person's life. Right.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. So, the first steps, perhaps, in surviving and winning against the mother of all complexes. It is a process. It needn't be as difficult as a lot of these analysts make out to be at all. And within what we've discussed today, and within everybody's contribution to the field of that, those answers are there. And if we approach it in the right way, it'll be frictionless, won't hurt, it'll be natural, and it'll be relatively quick. We don't even have to focus on speed. Speed provides itself as the medium for the expression of the solution. We don't have to chase speed. Speed comes.
You don't need speed.
Well,
We don't need
you
speed.
do not need a substance called speed. No, or any derivative thereof. That's the hare and the tortoise. It's an imaginary speed. It's not real, and you burn out. Anyway, on a positive note, thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for your contributions. Really appreciate it. Blessings all. I'll see you soon.
Yeah. See you soon.
Take care.